Imagine stepping quietly through the back corridor of a grand Victorian house after the family has gone to bed. The drawing room is silent, the dining table has been cleared, and the last fire in the formal rooms is beginning to fade. Behind the polished doors and elaborate decorations, however, another world is still awake. It is smaller, darker, more crowded, and almost completely hidden from the people who lived in the magnificent rooms upstairs. This was the world of the servants. In Victorian Britain, the grandest homes depended on an enormous amount of unseen labour, and much of that labour was performed by people who slept, ate, dressed, washed, and lived in cramped quarters tucked away at the back or top of the house. The servants' quarters were rarely designed for comfort. They were designed for efficiency, separation, and convenience. A servant might spend most of the day moving through rooms that were not truly theirs, touching expensive furniture, preparing elaborate meals, polishing silver, carrying coal, making beds, lighting fires, and attending to the private needs of the family, only to retreat at night to a tiny room that could be barely large enough for a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small chest. To understand Victorian domestic life, it is not enough to look at the magnificent staircase, the chandelier, or the dining room. You have to follow the servants through the doors the family rarely noticed. For a young maid entering service for the first time, the servants' quarters could feel strangely familiar and strangely unfamiliar at the same time. She might come from a rural village where her family lived in a small cottage, yet the house she entered could contain dozens of rooms, hundreds of objects, and an almost bewildering collection of rules. Her own sleeping space might be located several floors away from the family's bedrooms, sometimes in the attic beneath the roof. In winter, the room could be bitterly cold. In summer, the attic could become stifling. Sloping ceilings, exposed beams, narrow staircases, and small windows were common features of upper servant areas. A room that looked charming today in a restored historic house might have been an uncomfortable place for someone who worked 14 or more hours a day. The bed itself was often simple, and privacy could be limited, particularly for junior servants who shared rooms. A maid might have to keep her belongings carefully organized because there was very little space for anything unnecessary. Her wardrobe could consist of only a few dresses, aprons, stockings, shoes, and personal items. Unlike the family downstairs, she could not simply acquire new clothing whenever she wished. Everything she owned had to fit into the small space available to her. Morning began early, often before the household itself appeared to be awake, while the family might still be sleeping behind thick curtains and warm blankets. Servants were already beginning their work. Fires needed attention. Water had to be carried. Bedrooms had to be prepared. Breakfast had to be organized. Candles and lamps had to be checked. The quietness of the house could be deceptive, because behind the scenes, a complicated system was already moving. A housemaid might climb stairs carrying heavy buckets of water, empty chamber pots, clean grates, sweep floors, dust furniture, and prepare rooms before the family even stepped into them. A footman might polish shoes, clean silver, open doors, arrange carriages, and assist with formal meals. A cook could begin working long before breakfast, surrounded by heat, smoke, pots, knives, and ingredients that had to be transformed into meals for the household. Each person had a specific position, and the larger the house, the more complicated the hierarchy could become. The servants' quarters were connected to this hierarchy. Not every servant was treated equally. A butler or housekeeper occupied a very different position from a kitchen maid or scullery maid. Senior servants could have better rooms, more privacy, and greater authority. Junior servants often lived in the least desirable areas of the house. The housekeeper might have her own sitting room or bedroom, allowing her a degree of independence that younger maids did not have. The butler's position could also be relatively privileged, because he was responsible for supervising male household staff, managing wine and silver, and dealing directly with the master and guests. At the other end of the hierarchy was the kitchen maid, whose work was physically exhausting and often dirty. She might spend hours washing dishes, scrubbing floors, carrying supplies, cleaning kitchen equipment, and assisting the cook. Her hands could become rough from constant contact with hot water, soap, grease, and cleaning materials. One of the most fascinating things about servant quarters was the way they formed a miniature society within the house. The servants saw one another every day, often for longer hours than they saw their own families. They knew who was strict, who was kind, who was ambitious, who was lazy, and who could be trusted. They also knew the rhythms of the household better than almost anyone else. A maid might know exactly when the lady of the house preferred her tea, which guest complained about the temperature, which child was likely to wake during the night, and which family member disliked being disturbed in the morning. Servants became experts in anticipating needs before those needs were spoken aloud. This ability could make an experienced servant extremely valuable. But the closeness of servant life also created tension. There were disagreements over workload, jealousy over better positions, arguments about wages, complaints about unfair treatment, and anxieties about losing employment. A servant's position could depend heavily on the opinion of a housekeeper, butler, or employer. A bad reference could make it difficult to obtain another position. This meant that servants often had to navigate an environment where obedience was expected and personal independence was limited. The household was not simply a workplace for live. In servants, it was also their home, which meant the boundaries between working hours and private life were extremely blurred. Privacy was one of the greatest luxuries a servant rarely possessed. A maid might have a few minutes alone in her room before sleeping, but even then she knew she could be called back downstairs. Personal time was precious. A letter from home might be read quietly by candlelight. A small photograph might be kept inside a drawer. A ribbon, brooch, religious item, or keepsake might remind her of the family she had left behind. These tiny possessions could carry enormous emotional importance because they connected the servant to a life outside the household. For many young women, entering domestic service meant leaving home at an early age. The servants' quarters therefore contained not only beds and furniture, but also fragments of lives that existed beyond the walls of the mansion. Letters were particularly important. Communication with family members could help a servant maintain a sense of identity. Imagine a maid sitting beside a small window in an attic room after a long day, carefully unfolding a letter from her mother. The handwriting might describe a younger brother, a harvest, a wedding, or an ordinary event in the village. For a few minutes, the grand Victorian house surrounding her could disappear from her thoughts. She was no longer simply a maid polishing someone else's silver. She was someone's daughter, sister, friend, and perhaps someone with hopes of her own. Food was another revealing part of servant life. The family dining room might display several courses, expensive ingredients, elaborate desserts, and carefully arranged table settings. Servants, however, usually ate separately. Their meals depended on the household's arrangements and could be much simpler. In some homes, servants had their own dining room. In smaller households, they might eat in the kitchen or another service area. Their meals had to fit around their work. They could not always sit down together at convenient times because someone needed to remain available. Even eating became part of the household schedule. The kitchen itself was the center of servant life in many homes. It was often one of the busiest places in the entire house before modern conveniences transformed domestic work. Cooking required enormous physical effort. Ingredients needed to be cleaned, chopped, boiled, baked, roasted, preserved, or stored. Fires had to be maintained, water had to be heated. Utensils had to be washed by hand, waste had to be removed. A large household could generate an astonishing amount of work simply through meals. The cook therefore held an important position, but even the cook's work was demanding. Heat from the stove could make the kitchen unbearable during summer, while winter brought its own challenges. Then there was laundry. In wealthy households, enormous quantities of clothing, sheets, towels, tablecloths, and other fabrics needed regular cleaning. Washing was physically exhausting. Water had to be heated, fabrics scrubbed, rinsed, wrung, dried, and ironed. The ironing alone could occupy hours. Heavy Victorian clothing made the process even more demanding. A servant's quarters could therefore be connected to a whole network of workspaces designed to keep the household looking effortless. What appeared as spotless linen upstairs represented hours of labour downstairs. The servants also had their own language of signals and routines. Bells were one of the most important systems. A bell pull in a bedroom or sitting room could connect the family to the servant areas. When a bell rang, someone had to respond. Servants learned which bells belonged to which rooms and what different signals meant. But the story of the servants' quarters becomes even more revealing when you imagine what happened during the ordinary hours that historians sometimes describe with only a few sentences. The great Victorian house was not simply a building where servants worked. It was an entire system, and every person inside that system had a place, a schedule, and expectations that could shape nearly every part of their existence. From the moment a servant entered through the back door, the house could begin to feel like a world with its own rules. There were doors they were expected to use, rooms they entered only for work, staircases they preferred to avoid, times when they were allowed to eat, times when they were expected to remain silent, and people they had to address with carefully chosen words. The distinction between upstairs and downstairs was not merely architectural. It was social, psychological, and deeply woven into everyday life. A young girl entering service might have been barely old enough to understand what she was giving up. For many working-class families, domestic service was one of the most common forms of employment available to young women. A position could provide food, lodging, and wages, which made it attractive to families who had limited resources. Yet the arrangement also meant separation. A girl who had grown up surrounded by siblings might suddenly find herself living among strangers. Instead of hearing her mother's voice in the morning or seeing familiar faces at the breakfast table, she would wake to the sound of footsteps in a house where nearly everything belonged to someone else. Her first days could be overwhelming. She had to learn the household's routines quickly because mistakes could have consequences. A new maid might not know exactly how the family wanted beds arranged, how silver should be polished, how fires should be laid, or which garments required special care. She might be watched closely by a senior servant who had little patience for repeated errors. The young maid therefore had to observe constantly. She learned by watching hands, listening to instructions, and remembering details. Eventually, tasks that once seemed complicated became automatic. The uniform reinforced the transformation. A servant's clothing was practical and immediately recognizable. Aprons protected dresses from dirt. Caps or other forms of headwear helped create the appearance expected of domestic staff. Shoes had to be suitable for constant movement. Clothing could also indicate rank. A housekeeper did not necessarily dress exactly like a kitchen maid, and a footman had a very different appearance from a scullery worker. To put on the uniform was, in a sense, to step into a role. Personal identity was temporarily covered by professional identity. Yet servants did not stop being individuals simply because they wore uniforms. They had preferences and personalities, and these often became visible only in the privacy of the quarters. One maid might be exceptionally serious about her duties, while another was constantly joking with her friends. One servant might dream of saving enough money to leave service, while another hoped to rise through the ranks and become a housekeeper. Someone might be fascinated by the family's books, while another cared more about fashion, music, or news from the outside world. The servant quarters could therefore become a place where social boundaries softened slightly. A kitchen maid and a housemaid might have different duties, but after work they could share stories. Senior servants might advise younger workers about finding better positions. Someone who had been in service for 10 years might explain which employers were fair and which ones had reputations for being difficult. Knowledge like this could be valuable because employment was often obtained through recommendations and personal networks. A servant's future could depend on knowing where opportunities existed. References were particularly important. When a servant left one household, the next employer might want evidence that the worker had been reliable. A favourable reference could open doors. A negative one could make the next position much harder to find. This created an additional layer of pressure. A servant might tolerate an unpleasant situation because leaving without a good reference could damage her future. At the same time, experienced servants who had built strong reputations could have more freedom to choose their next positions. The hierarchy among servants could be surprisingly detailed. At the top might stand the housekeeper, who supervised female household staff and managed many aspects of domestic organization. She could have significant authority and might be responsible for assigning duties, checking rooms, overseeing supplies, and reporting problems to the employer. The butler held a comparable position among male servants and could be responsible for dining arrangements, wine, silver, household service, and sometimes financial matters. Below them were maids, footmen, kitchen workers, and other specialists. In very large houses, there could be gardeners, coachmen, valets, ladies' maids, nurses, laundresses, and other workers whose jobs were narrowly defined. This hierarchy affected where people slept. The best servant rooms were generally reserved for those with greater status. Junior servants were more likely to be placed in attic rooms or shared spaces. The distance between a servant's room and the family's rooms could also reflect the logic of the house. Servants needed to be close enough to respond quickly, but separated enough to remain invisible. The result was an unusual architectural compromise. Servants lived near the people they served, but apart from them. At night, this arrangement could become particularly strange. Imagine a large Victorian mansion after the family had gone to sleep. The main corridors were quiet. Curtains covered the windows. Fires had been banked. Yet somewhere behind the scenes, a servant might still be awake. Perhaps the lady of the house needed assistance. Perhaps a child was ill. Perhaps a late guest had arrived. Perhaps the kitchen was still being cleaned after an elaborate dinner. A household could appear asleep while the servant system remained partially active. Night work could be especially demanding for servants responsible for children, elderly residents, or sick members of the family. A nursemaid might sleep near the nursery and be expected to respond immediately if a child cried. A personal maid could be required to prepare clothing for the following morning. A housekeeper might worry about household security or unfinished tasks. The idea of a strict boundary between work and rest was therefore often unrealistic. The physical environment of the quarters also mattered. Victorian houses were not necessarily warm and comfortable throughout. Central heating, as we understand it today, was not standard. Heat came from fireplaces, stoves. Servants were among the people responsible for keeping those systems working. The irony was obvious. They created warmth for everyone else, while their own rooms could remain cold. A maid might spend hours carrying coal, lighting fires, and cleaning ashes, then return to a chilly attic room. Water presented another challenge in modern homes. Turning on a tap is effortless. In many Victorian households, water systems were far less convenient. Depending on the house and period, servants could be responsible for carrying water to bedrooms, filling wash basins, preparing baths, and removing used water. A large household could require an enormous amount of water simply to maintain ordinary cleanliness. The servant's back and shoulders effectively became part of the household's plumbing system. Personal washing was another aspect that reveals the difference between Victorian expectations and modern assumptions. Bathing could require considerable preparation. Hot water had to be produced and carried. Tubs had to be filled and emptied. Towels and linens had to be washed. Servants often handled these tasks for family members. Their own washing had to fit into the schedule and resources available to them. Cleanliness was expected of servants, but achieving it could itself involve labour. The laundry room could be one of the harshest workspaces. Steam, heat, dampness and physical effort combined to create exhausting conditions. Clothes were scrubbed, rinsed, wrung, dried and ironed. Large sheets were particularly difficult to handle. Ironing required heavy heated irons that had to remain at the correct temperature. A worker could spend hours repeating the same movements. The spotless appearance of a Victorian bedroom therefore depended on a process that was anything but effortless. The same was true of polished surfaces. Victorian interiors were famous for their decorative detail. Mirrors, brass fixtures, wooden furniture, silver objects, glass, and elaborate ornaments all required cleaning. Dust had countless places to settle. A servant's work was often repetitive precisely because cleanliness was temporary. The moment a surface was polished, it could begin accumulating dust again. The servant's achievement disappeared into the appearance of the room. This idea of invisible labour is perhaps the most important key to understanding the servant quarters. Much of the work had to be done repeatedly, but left no visible evidence. A bed made in the morning looked as though it had always been neat. A polished dining table looked naturally brilliant. A clean shirt appeared simply clean. A warm room felt naturally warm. Guests rarely saw the work that produced these conditions. They saw the result. The servants, however, experienced the process. They knew how heavy the laundry was. They knew how hot the kitchen became. They knew how long it took to polish silver. And there was another side to the servants' quarters that becomes clear only when you stop looking at them as simple sleeping spaces and start imagining them as the private world of people whose public lives belonged almost entirely to someone else. A Victorian servant might spend the majority of waking hours in rooms where she had no personal ownership, following instructions that had been established long before she arrived. Yet when she finally returned to her own corner of the house, even a tiny bedroom could become a place of control. She could decide where to put her shoes, how to fold her clothes, where to keep a letter, and when to extinguish the candle. These small decisions mattered because so much else was determined by the household. For a young maid, learning the geography of the house was almost like learning a new language. The main staircase, service staircase, pantry, scullery, kitchen, laundry, nursery, bedrooms, linen cupboards, servants' hall, and back entrance all had different purposes. She needed to know which route was fastest, which floorboards creaked, which doors had to be opened carefully, and which corridors were likely to contain members of the family. She learned to move around the house almost instinctively. After enough months she could walk from the kitchen to a bedroom in darkness because her body remembered the route. The servants' hall could become the social center of this hidden world. Unlike the formal dining room, it was not designed to impress visitors. It was practical and lived. In here, servants could eat, talk, exchange information, and briefly relax. The atmosphere could change dramatically depending on the household. In one home, the servants might become a close-knit group who joked constantly. In another, strict hierarchy could follow them even into the servants' hall. The personalities of senior servants mattered enormously. A kind housekeeper could make difficult work more bearable. A harsh one could turn every mistake into a source of anxiety. Meals in the servants' hall could also reveal the social structure of the house. The head servants might sit separately or receive better food. Junior workers could have less freedom. A kitchen maid who had spent hours preparing a complicated dinner might eat only after the main household had finished. The servants' meal was therefore not simply a break from work. It was another reminder of where each person stood within the hierarchy. Still, these meals could provide some of the happiest moments of the day. Imagine several exhausted servants finally sitting together, hands still rough from work, listening to someone describe an amusing incident involving a guest. Someone might laugh so hard that another servant tells them to be quiet. Someone else might complain about a difficult employer. Another might produce a small treat purchased during an afternoon off. For a few minutes, the household hierarchy outside the room seemed less important. The friendships formed in these spaces could last for years. Servants often moved between households, but they carried names and memories with them. One maid might recommend another to a new employer. A former housemate could send a letter describing an available position. These networks were part of how servants navigated employment. The servant community had its own information system. The kitchen had a similar social importance, but with much greater pressure. The cook was often one of the most powerful people among the female servants, because food could determine the household's satisfaction. A good cook could become highly valued. But the kitchen was also where mistakes became obvious. A burned dish, late course, spoiled ingredient, or poorly prepared meal could attract criticism immediately. The kitchen maid lived at the bottom of this culinary hierarchy and often performed the most unpleasant tasks. Before she could learn advanced cooking skills, she might spend countless hours cleaning. Pots had to be scrubbed, floors had to be washed, vegetables needed preparation, ashes had to be removed, water had to be carried. The glamorous image of Victorian cooking, with elaborate puddings and beautiful roasted meats, concealed an exhausting amount of physical labour. The scullery was particularly demanding. It was a place of steam, dirty dishes, grease, and endless repetition. The person working there could finish one pile of dishes only to discover another waiting. The work seemed never-ending, because every meal created another cycle of washing. A servant could spend an entire day surrounded by evidence of other people's meals. This reveals an important truth about Victorian luxury. Luxury did not eliminate work. It redistributed work. The wealthier the household, the more services could be demanded, and the more people were needed to provide them. An enormous house required constant maintenance. More rooms meant more floors to sweep, more windows to clean, more fires to tend, more beds to make, more clothing to wash, and more food to prepare. The servants' quarters were therefore directly connected to the scale of the family's wealth. Our modest household might have only one or two domestic servants, forcing them to perform multiple roles. A wealthy mansion could employ a much larger staff, allowing duties to become specialized. One person might polish silver, while another handled laundry. One servant might care exclusively for a child. Another might manage the wine cellar. A gardener could spend all day maintaining the grounds. A coachman could be responsible for horses and vehicles. A lady's maid could devote herself to the wardrobe and personal appearance of one woman. This specialization could make work more efficient, but it could also make servants feel trapped within narrow roles. A maid might spend years doing essentially the same tasks. The servants' quarters reflected this division. People working in different departments could sleep in different areas, and the physical arrangement reinforced their professional identity. The housekeeper's room was especially interesting because it occupied a position between the servant world and the family world. The housekeeper had authority, but she was still an employee. She might speak directly with the mistress of the house about household expenses, supplies, staff behavior, and schedules. She could possess keys to cupboards and rooms, maintain inventories, and oversee the domestic operation. Her room might therefore contain objects associated with management rather than simple labor, notebooks, keys, correspondence, household lists, and perhaps account books. The housekeeper's responsibilities could be enormous. She needed to know how much linen existed when supplies were running low, which rooms required attention, which servants were available, and what tasks had been completed. She could become the person who knew the household most completely. If the master and mistress were the public faces of the home, the housekeeper was often one of the people who kept its internal machinery functioning. For a young servant, reaching such a position could represent considerable advancement, but it required years of experience, reliability, and knowledge. The servant who began by carrying coal or cleaning bedrooms could eventually become the person giving instructions to other workers. Male servants had their own hierarchy. A footman might be expected to answer doors, serve meals, carry luggage, polish shoes, assist with carriages, and perform other visible duties. Footmen were often chosen partly for their appearance because formal households valued presentation. Their uniforms could make them part of the visual spectacle of wealth, yet the polished appearance seen by guests concealed the work required to maintain it. A footman's shoes had to be clean. His clothing had to be pressed. His movements had to be controlled. He had to remain attentive during formal occasions. When the family travelled, he might be responsible for luggage and countless practical details. He could spend long periods standing or waiting. A valet occupied a different position because he worked closely with an individual male member of the family. He might prepare clothing, assist with dressing, maintain personal items, and organize travel. The valet could know intimate details of his employer's life. This proximity could create trust, but it also required discretion. A servant in such a position was expected to know much without saying much. The lady's maid occupied a similar role for wealthy women. Her work could include dressing, hair care, wardrobe organization, packing, sewing, and preparation for social events. A lady's maid might spend hours handling beautiful fabrics and expensive accessories, while earning only a fraction of the wealth represented by those objects. She could know the difference between a casual dress and a formal one, which jewelry was reserved for certain occasions, and how to repair delicate clothing. This contrast between handling luxury and possessing almost none of it is one of the most striking features of domestic service. A servant could spend an entire day polishing silver she could never afford, preparing food she rarely ate, cleaning rooms she did not inhabit, and arranging clothing worth more than her annual wages. The objects passed through her hands, but they belonged to someone else. Yet proximity to wealth could also provide education. Servants learned about fabrics, foods, manners, household management, travel, and social customs. A talented servant could use this knowledge to advance. Some became highly skilled professionals within the domestic service industry. There was also a surprising amount of practical knowledge in the servant quarters. Servants needed to understand cleaning methods, fabric care, cooking techniques, preservation, stain removal, fire management, and household organization. There was another reality waiting behind the servant's door. one that had little to do with the romantic image of Victorian mansions that survives in photographs and period dramas. The servants' quarters were not simply hidden bedrooms attached to a beautiful house. They were part of a carefully organized world where every sound, movement, object, and minute of the day could have a purpose. If the family lived according to social expectations, the servants often lived according to the clock. Their mornings began before the household stirred, their evenings ended after everyone else had retired, and their personal lives were squeezed into whatever spaces remained between responsibilities. The clock was perhaps the most important object in a servant's world. A wealthy family could lose track of time during a long breakfast or afternoon conversation, but servants could not afford to. Breakfast had to be ready at a particular hour. Bedrooms had to be cleaned before occupants returned. Meals had to appear at precise times. Fires had to be lit before rooms became cold. The dining room had to be prepared before guests arrived. A servant who arrived even a few minutes late could disrupt an entire chain of work. This meant that servants developed an almost instinctive relationship with time. They knew how long it took to carry water upstairs, how long a fire needed before it was useful, how long laundry could remain soaking, how quickly a meal had to move from kitchen to dining room, and how many minutes were available between one task and another. The house functioned because hundreds of small calculations were made without anyone upstairs having to think about them. Even sleep was controlled by this schedule. A servant might finally climb into bed after midnight, knowing that another early morning was waiting. The mattress might not have been particularly comfortable, and the room could be cold, but exhaustion often overcame discomfort. Yet deep sleep was not guaranteed. A bell could ring, a child could cry, a family member could need assistance. A late arrival could require someone to open the door. In a large household, the servant's day did not always end simply because the clock had passed midnight. For servants responsible for bedrooms, the morning could begin with a ritual of quiet preparation. Curtains were opened, fires were checked, water was carried in, clothing might be laid out, beds were made, sheets straightened, blankets folded, and rooms aired. Chamber pots had to be emptied and cleaned, dust had to be removed from surfaces. Every task had to be completed before the household's occupants became fully active. This created a strange experience of time. The servant could enter a bedroom while its occupant was still asleep, quietly perform several tasks, and leave before the person fully realized anyone had been there. The family woke into a room that appeared prepared naturally. The labor had vanished, and disappearing labor was one of the defining features of domestic service. The more efficiently a servant worked, the less visible the work became. A perfectly polished mirror did not announce who had polished it. A neatly made bed did not explain who had stripped the sheets. A warm room did not reveal who had carried the coal. A clean shirt did not tell the story of the laundry. A meal placed on the table did not show how many hours had been spent preparing it. The servants' quarters were where the people responsible for these invisible transformations returned when their work was done. The physical separation between upstairs and downstairs was therefore more than a matter of convenience. It allowed the household to maintain an illusion of effortless comfort. The family could live surrounded by order, while the disorder of work was pushed into kitchens, laundries, storage rooms, service corridors, and servant bedrooms. This separation could be especially noticeable during formal entertaining. Imagine a Victorian dinner party, with several important guests arriving in the evening. From the perspective of the guests, the house appears magical. Lamps glow warmly. Flowers decorate the rooms. Music may drift from a nearby salon. The dining table shines under candlelight. Guests speak, laugh, and admire one another's clothing. But behind the scenes, servants are moving constantly. Simone checks the wine. Simone carries plates. Someone watches the kitchen. Someone opens a door. Someone adjusts a fire. Someone removes used dishes. Someone waits in a corridor. Someone notices that a guest has dropped a glove. Someone is prepared to respond if another bell rings. The guests may never see more than a few servants standing quietly beside the table. That calm appearance is the result of intense coordination. For junior servants, formal evenings could be exhausting. They might spend hours standing, walking, carrying, waiting, and returning. Their shoes could become painful. Their backs could ache. Yet their posture and expression were expected to remain controlled. The household's guests were not supposed to see exhaustion. When the last guest finally left, the servant's work was not over. The dining room still needed to be cleared. The kitchen still needed cleaning. Silver needed attention. Glasses needed washing. Food had to be stored. Floors might need sweeping. The servants could remain awake long after the family had retired. The servants' hall could finally become active again. Someone might complain about the amount of work. Someone else might laugh about a guest's strange behaviour. Another servant might simply be too tired to speak. Then, eventually, the house would become quiet. Only then could the workers return to their rooms. This cycle repeated after weddings, Christmas celebrations, birthdays, political dinners, hunting parties, weekend guests, and other events. The more elaborate the household's social life, the more demanding the servant's schedule could become. Christmas was especially revealing for the family. Christmas could mean decorations, presents, special meals, parties, music and traditions for servants. It meant preparing enormous quantities of food, cleaning extra rooms, handling guests, polishing silver, carrying supplies, and maintaining the household throughout the celebrations. Yet Christmas could also bring bonuses, gifts, tips, or opportunities for servants to spend time with one another. The contrast between upstairs celebration and downstairs labour was not always bitter. Servants could enjoy the festive atmosphere too. They might receive leftover treats, exchange small gifts, decorate their own quarters, or enjoy a special meal together. The servants' world was not completely separate from the family's celebrations. It simply experienced them differently. Birthdays could have a similar effect. A wealthy child's birthday might involve decorations, guests, special food, and presents. The nursery servants might work for days preparing the event, yet they could also become emotionally involved because they had helped raise the child. Watching the child's excitement could provide genuine satisfaction. This is why servant life cannot be reduced to a simple story of misery. The system was unequal, sometimes harsh, and often exhausting, but individual experiences varied enormously. Some servants were treated well, others were treated badly. Some found friendship and opportunity, others experienced loneliness. Some employers were generous, others were demanding. The same architectural space could represent security to one person and confinement to another. The servants' quarters also contained evidence of changing technology. As the Victorian period progressed, household innovations slowly altered daily routines. Improved plumbing reduced some of the burden of carrying water. Better heating systems changed how rooms were warmed. Gas lighting extended the useful hours of the day. Mechanical devices could assist with laundry and cooking. Communication systems became more sophisticated. Yet new technology sometimes created new expectations. If a new appliance made one task faster, employers might expect more work to be completed in the same amount of time. Convenience did not necessarily mean shorter working hours. Instead, it could allow households to demand a higher standard of cleanliness or service. The same pattern appeared in clothing. Victorian fashion created enormous demands on servants. Dresses could have multiple layers, delicate materials, complicated fastenings, and decorative elements. Men's formal clothing also required careful maintenance. Shoes needed polishing, hats needed cleaning, gloves needed attention. Servants became experts in preserving garments that their employers might wear only occasionally. A lady's maid could know an entire wardrobe almost better than its owner. She knew which dress belonged to which event, where a stain had appeared, which fabric needed special handling, and which garment was likely to require repair. She might sew late at night because a dress needed to be ready the next morning. Sewing was another skill that connected personal life with professional work. A servant could repair her own clothing while also mending household garments. A needle and thread might therefore be among the most useful possessions in her room. A damaged uniform could not simply be discarded. Clothing represented money and had to be maintained. The servant's room might also contain a small mirror. Personal grooming had to be managed around the household schedule. A servant was expected to appear clean and presentable, even after hours of physical labor. Hair had to be arranged. Clothing had to be tidy. Hands had to be clean before serving food. The contradiction was striking. A servant could spend hours performing dirty work and then be expected to appear immaculate when standing beside the family. The deeper you look into the servant quarters of a Victorian house, the more you realize that the hidden rooms were not merely places where workers slept. They were the private infrastructure of an entire social order. The people who lived there were responsible for turning wealth into comfort and comfort into something that appeared completely natural. Their work was supposed to disappear the moment it was finished. A room should look as though nobody had cleaned it. A meal should appear without explanation. A fire should be warm without anyone mentioning the coal that had been carried. A gentleman should look perfectly dressed without anyone thinking about the hands that had prepared his clothes. A lady should appear elegant without anyone seeing the maid who had spent hours arranging her hair and clothing. The servant quarters were where all of those invisible efforts eventually returned. Imagine entering one of these rooms early in the morning before the household has fully awakened. The light coming through the small window is weak and the air is cool. The room is simple because there is little reason to fill a servant's bedroom with decoration. A narrow bed occupies much of the available space. Nearby sits a small washstand, perhaps with a basin and jug. A chair might hold yesterday's work clothes. A few garments hang from hooks or rest inside a small chest. There may be a pair of worn shoes beneath the bed. On a tiny table sits an object that has nothing to do with work. A photograph, a letter, perhaps a small book. That little object may be the most personal thing in the entire room. The servant wakes because the day is already waiting. There is no luxury of remaining in bed simply because she is tired. The household schedule does not change because she slept badly. She dresses quickly, washes, arranges her hair, and puts on the clothing that marks her as a worker. The room that was hers for the night becomes almost irrelevant the moment she steps through the door. From then on, she belongs to the rhythm of the house. The first hours of the morning can be among the busiest. In a large household, dozens of small tasks must be completed before breakfast. Fires need attention. Water has to be carried. Curtains are opened, rooms are aired, beds are stripped, clothes are prepared, shoes may need polishing, ashes must be removed. Breakfast tables have to be arranged. Kitchens are already active. The servant may move so quickly that she barely notices the passage of time. A stairway is climbed. A corridor is crossed. A door is opened. A task is completed. Another begins. There is little room for hesitation. One of the most difficult things for a modern person to understand is how physically demanding these routines could be before the widespread availability of modern household equipment. Today, a washing machine can process a large quantity of clothing while someone does something else. A vacuum cleaner can move across a floor with relatively little effort. A central heating system can warm a building without anyone carrying fuel from room to room. A modern kitchen can produce hot water instantly. Victorian servants often performed the physical work that modern machines perform for us. They carried, they scrubbed, they lifted, they wrung, they polished, they climbed, they swept, they repeated. And because wealthy households expected high standards, these tasks had to be performed repeatedly. A floor could be clean in the morning and dirty again by afternoon. A fireplace could be arranged beautifully and then covered in ash. A mirror could be polished and then marked by fingerprints. Laundry could be washed and immediately become part of another cycle. The work had no final completion. There was only the next round. This repetition could create a strange psychological experience. A servant might spend an entire day working and still wake the following morning with almost exactly the same tasks waiting. Success did not eliminate the work. Success for a person looking at a Victorian mansion today. The absence of visible dirt may suggest that keeping the house clean was easy. The opposite was often true. Cleanliness was a constant achievement. The servants were the ones who achieved it. The laundry room demonstrates this particularly well. Clothing was not simply washed and dried. It had to be sorted first. Different fabrics required different treatment. Stains needed attention. Water had to be heated. Garments had to be scrubbed. Heavy pieces had to be lifted and wrung. After washing, they needed to be dried, folded, and often ironed. Ironing itself was a demanding process. The irons had to be heated, sometimes using a stove or other heat source. They became heavy and uncomfortable to handle. Large sheets and tablecloths required considerable strength. The person doing the ironing could work for hours in a hot room. And yet, when the family sat down at a clean table, they saw only a beautiful white cloth. The same was true of bedding. A wealthy household could have an astonishing quantity of linen sheets, pillowcases, towels, napkins, tablecloths, and other fabrics all required care. Every piece had to be washed, dried, folded, and stored. A linen cupboard could represent hundreds of hours of labour. The housekeeper might know every shelf. She might know how many sheets were available. She might know which pieces were new and which were beginning to wear. She might know which household member was careless with linens and which one was particularly demanding. The linen room could therefore be a kind of archive of household life. Another overlooked task was waste disposal. Victorian households produced considerable amounts of waste, and servants had to manage it. Ashes from fireplaces had to be removed. Kitchen waste had to be dealt with. Chamber pots needed cleaning. Dirty water had to be carried away. The work was unpleasant precisely because the family expected not to encounter the evidence of their own consumption. Servants removed the traces. This pattern repeated everywhere. They removed dirt. They removed ash. They removed dirty dishes. They removed used linens. They removed waste. They removed signs that work had occurred. The household remained beautiful because the evidence of daily life was continuously erased. The servant quarters, by contrast, were spaces where the evidence of work could accumulate. Shoes became worn, aprons became stained, hands became rough, clothing needed repair. People became tired. These physical signs of labour were unavoidable. A young maid's hands might reveal more about her occupation than her uniform did. Constant washing and scrubbing could leave the skin dry and irritated. Working with hot water, soap, cleaning agents, and rough materials could take its toll. A kitchen worker exposed to heat and smoke could finish the day with an entirely different physical experience from the wealthy family dining in a cool room. The servant's body was part of the machinery. This was particularly true for tasks involving stairs. A large house could contain many levels, and servants might climb them dozens or even hundreds of times during a day, carrying trays, buckets, laundry baskets, coal scuttles, or luggage made the effort more difficult. The main staircase might be wide and impressive, but servants often used narrower service stairs because those routes were faster and kept them away from guests. The back staircase could become one of the most familiar places in a servant's life. It was where conversations happened briefly. It was where workers hurried. It was where trays were carried. It was where someone might stop for a few seconds to catch their breath. It was also where the social architecture of the house became physically visible. The family had one route, the servants had another. In some houses, the division was so carefully designed that guests could go through an entire visit without realizing how many people were moving around them. Food could travel through hidden passages. Laundry could disappear behind doors. Servants could appear in one room and vanish into another. The house operated like a stage. The family and guests were the audience. The servants were backstage workers, and the servant quarters were their dressing rooms, break rooms, bedrooms, and meeting places all at once. This theatrical quality was especially strong during formal occasions. A dinner party could require rehearsed movements. A footman might know exactly when to enter. A maid might know when to remove a plate. The butler might coordinate the entire service. Every movement was designed to look effortless. The servants' quarters were therefore also places of preparation. Uniforms were checked, shoes were cleaned, hair was arranged, instructions were repeated, schedules were discussed. A servant might receive a warning that a particular guest was difficult, or that a particular family member was in a bad mood. Information circulated rapidly among workers because knowing what to expect could prevent mistakes. The servants had their own form of intelligence. They knew the household's moods. They knew the routines. They knew which doors were safe to enter and which ones should be approached carefully. They knew which guests liked conversation and which preferred silence. They knew when the family wanted to be left alone. They knew which child was likely to cause trouble. They knew which household rules were strict and which could occasionally be bent. This knowledge gave servants a strange kind of power. They were socially subordinate, but they possessed information. A long-serving servant could know the family's private habits better than anyone outside the household. There was a rhythm to servant life that could become so familiar that the house itself seemed to dictate the movements of everyone inside it. Long before the first family member appeared at breakfast, the servant quarters were already stirring. A door opened quietly. Floorboards creaked beneath tired feet. Someone struck a match. Someone else carried a candle down a dark passage. In the kitchen, the first fire began to burn. Somewhere upstairs, a maid prepared to enter a bedroom. The great Victorian house was waking from the inside out, and the people who made that awakening possible were almost never the ones who received credit for it. The first sound of the day might have been the servant's alarm, but the real alarm was often the household itself. A bell could summon someone. A footstep could signal that a family member was awake. A change in routine could mean that an entire schedule had to be rearranged. Servants learned to listen carefully because sound carried information. The creak of a particular bedroom door could mean that the mistress was getting up. The opening of a nursery door could mean that children were awake. A carriage arriving early could suddenly create another set of tasks. The house communicated with its workers through bells, footsteps, voices, doors, and clocks. This meant that servants were always listening. A housemaid could hear the difference between an ordinary footstep and the hurried steps of someone who needed assistance. A butler could recognize the sound of the front door and know whether a guest had arrived. A nursemaid could distinguish between the cries of a child who was frightened and one who was simply restless. The longer a servant stayed in a household, the more completely they understood its sounds. The house became almost like a living creature. It had moods, it had routines, it had noises that appeared at certain hours, and servants knew them all. The morning rush could be especially intense. Several rooms might need attention at once. Beds had to be stripped before fresh linen could be brought in. Clothing needed to be collected. Fires had to be maintained. Water had to be replaced. Breakfast preparations were underway. The kitchen needed supplies. The dining room needed to be arranged. A single household could generate dozens of small demands within a few minutes. The servants had to prioritize. Experience mattered because a new servant might attempt to complete every task in the order she noticed it, while an experienced worker knew which jobs had to happen first. If breakfast was approaching, the dining room took priority. If a family member was preparing to leave, their clothing and belongings became urgent. If a fire was dying in a bedroom, someone had to respond before the room became cold. The ability to anticipate needs was one of the most valuable skills a servant could develop. The best servants did not simply respond to instructions. They predicted them. They knew that a particular gentleman would want his coat ready at a certain time. They knew that a lady would need a particular dress prepared for an afternoon visit. They knew that a child would become hungry after returning from school. They knew that the household preferred tea at a certain hour. This anticipation made service appear effortless, but it required constant observation. A servant was always watching, and being watched in return. Employers could notice small details. A dusty corner, a poorly polished spoon, a missing button, or a delayed response could become a criticism. This meant servants had to maintain high standards even when exhausted. The pressure could be particularly intense for younger workers. A young maid might feel that she was constantly being evaluated. She had to learn quickly because nobody had time to teach the same lesson repeatedly. Her mistakes could become embarrassing, especially if corrected in front of other servants. Yet the servant quarters could also provide a place where mistakes were discussed without the presence of employers. An older worker might explain how to avoid repeating an error. Another might tell a funny story about making an even worse mistake in her first position. Experience was shared through conversation. This informal education was essential. A young servant learned not only how to clean a room, but how to behave within the social structure of the household. She learned when to speak, when to remain silent, when to knock, when to wait, when to move quickly, when to pretend not to hear, when to ask a question, and when not to ask one. These rules were rarely written down. They were learned through observation. The servant quarters were therefore schools of domestic etiquette. But the lessons were not always gentle. A mistake could lead to dismissal, and dismissal could have serious consequences. For a live-in servant, losing employment could mean losing both wages and accommodation at the same time. There was no simple separation between work and home. If the employer told a servant to leave, the servant might have to find another place to sleep almost immediately. This created a powerful incentive to remain employed. References became essential. A good reference could open the door to another household. A poor reference could close several doors. Servants therefore had to protect their reputations. Reliability mattered, honesty mattered, discretion mattered, and sometimes appearance mattered too. A household did not want servants who looked careless or unprofessional. This explains why uniforms were so important. They created consistency and made servants immediately identifiable. They also erased some differences between individuals, regardless of where a maid had come from. Once she wore the household uniform, she became part of the service staff. But beneath the uniform, personal differences remained. Some servants were ambitious, some were shy, some were homesick, some were homesick, some enjoyed domestic work. Others dreamed of leaving it. The quarters brought these personalities together. A servants' hall could become a place of laughter, argument, gossip, advice, and sometimes silence. After a difficult day, people did not always want to talk. Sometimes the best thing was simply to sit down and eat. Meals could be comforting precisely because they were shared. A servant might have spent hours alone cleaning a room, but at mealtime she was surrounded by others who understood exactly how tired she felt. There was no need to explain the aching feet. Everyone had them, no need to explain the frustration of a difficult employer. Someone else had experienced it. No need to explain the pressure of a large dinner. Everyone had survived one. The servant community provided something the grand household could not: mutual understanding. Yet, even among servants, privacy was limited. The quarters could be crowded. Junior workers might share bedrooms. Beds could be positioned close together. Personal conversations might be overheard. A servant might have nowhere to go when she wanted to be alone. This made emotional privacy just as valuable as physical privacy. A letter from home might therefore be read secretly. A personal conversation might take place during a short walk outside. A private thought might remain completely unspoken. The servant had to find small spaces for individuality. Sometimes those spaces existed in unexpected places: a linen cupboard, a quiet staircase, a corner of the kitchen, a garden bench during an afternoon off, a few minutes near a window. These moments could become precious. The garden itself could have a different meaning for servants. To the family, it might be a place for leisure, walking, entertaining guests, or enjoying flowers. For servants, the garden could represent work if they were responsible for outdoor tasks. But it could also provide a rare opportunity to breathe fresh air away from the corridors. Gardeners had their own demanding routines. They maintained lawns, flower beds, trees, paths, greenhouses, and kitchen gardens. Their quarters might be separate from the main servants' rooms, especially on large estates. They were part of the hidden labour that made the property impressive. The same was true of stable workers. Horses required constant care. They had to be fed, groomed, exercised, and prepared for travel. Stables had to be cleaned. Carriages needed maintenance. A coachman might spend much of his day outdoors regardless of weather. The grand entrance of a Victorian house might show a magnificent carriage arriving. Behind that image was an entire world of labour. Someone had prepared the horses. Someone had cleaned the carriage. Someone had checked the harness. Someone had loaded luggage. Someone had waited in the cold again. The finished scene concealed the process. The servants' quarters were connected to all of these hidden systems. Even when workers slept in different buildings, they were part of the same household machine. The housekeeper might coordinate with the cook. The cook might depend on deliveries. The butler might coordinate with the coachman. The maid might communicate with the nursery. The gardener might provide produce for the kitchen. The laundry staff might depend on the housekeeper for schedules. Every department affected another. A delay in one area could create problems elsewhere. This is why large households required organization that could resemble a small business. There were inventories, schedules, purchases, wages, maintenance, staffing, supplies, repairs, waste. The house was a workplace long before modern offices existed, and the housekeeper or butler could function almost like a manager. They had to keep the operation running. The family might never know how many small problems had been solved before they became visible. If you could somehow walk through a Victorian mansion at the exact moment when the family had gone to sleep, you might initially think the building was empty. The grand entrance hall would be still. The drawing room would be dark. The dining room would be silent, its chairs pushed neatly beneath the table. Heavy curtains would cover the windows, and the last warmth of the evening fires would slowly disappear. But if you moved beyond the rooms designed for visitors and followed the narrower passages toward the back of the house, you would discover that the mansion was not sleeping at all. It was simply changing hands. The visible household had gone to bed, and the hidden household was beginning its final work of the day. This was the world that existed behind the doors of the servants' quarters. It was a world of narrow corridors, small bedrooms, service staircases, kitchens, pantries, laundries, storage rooms, and shared spaces where workers could finally speak freely after spending hours maintaining someone else's home. To modern eyes, the separation could seem astonishing. A family might occupy enormous bedrooms with fireplaces, upholstered furniture, wardrobes, mirrors, and private sitting areas, while a servant slept in a room so small that the bed seemed to consume most of the available floor space. Yet the difference was accepted as part of the social order. The servant's room did not need to impress anyone. It needed to provide somewhere to sleep. That was the expectation, and because the servant was considered part of the household staff rather than a member of the family, privacy was treated as a luxury rather than a necessity. Junior servants might share rooms, others might sleep in attic spaces where the roofline made the ceiling uneven. A room could be hot in summer and cold in winter. The window might be small, the walls might be plain. Furniture was generally practical rather than decorative. But simplicity did not mean that the room was meaningless. Quite the opposite, a servant's bedroom could become one of the few places where personal identity survived outside the uniform. Perhaps there was a small photograph on the table. Perhaps a letter was tucked beneath a pillow. Perhaps a ribbon from a previous employer was kept inside a box. Perhaps a servant had a favourite book. Perhaps a small religious object rested beside the bed. Perhaps there was a tiny vase containing a flower picked during a rare moment outside. These objects were reminders that the person sleeping there had a life beyond the household, and that life was often far away. Many domestic servants came from rural areas and moved into towns or cities to find employment. A young woman might leave a village where she knew every road and every neighbour and enter a household where even the staircase felt unfamiliar. She had to adapt not only to a new job but to an entirely new social environment. The first night could be frightening. The house might be enormous. The corridors might be confusing. The sounds unfamiliar. A distant door closing could make her wonder whether someone was calling her. A bell might ring unexpectedly. Footsteps might pass outside. The first few nights could be filled with nervousness. Eventually, however, the house became familiar. She learned which sounds mattered. She learned which doors belonged to which rooms. She learned where the kitchen was. She learned where the linen was kept. She learned which staircase was fastest. She learned how to find her room in darkness. The building that once seemed enormous became a map inside her mind. This knowledge was part of becoming an experienced servant. A new worker needed instructions. An experienced worker needed very few. She could walk into a room and immediately notice what was wrong. A crooked picture, a missing item, a dying fire, a stain. A window left open, a garment that needed repair. The more experienced she became, the more she could manage without being told. This was valuable to employers because a household functioned best when servants could anticipate problems. But anticipation could also become exhausting. A servant was expected. The family might not think about whether enough coal remained for the evening. The servant had to. The family might not notice that linen supplies were running low. The housekeeper had to. The family might not know that a child's shoes were becoming too small. The nursery staff had to. The family might not realize that a guest had dietary preferences. The cook and butler had to remember. The servants were therefore responsible not only for doing tasks, but for maintaining a constant awareness of the household. This invisible mental work was just as important as physical labor. The housekeeper might spend hours planning. The cook might calculate quantities. The butler might organize formal service. A lady's maid might remember an entire wardrobe. A governess might plan lessons. A nursemaid might remember children's routines. Each servant carried information in their head. The household depended on memory. In an age before digital calendars and instant communication, much of this information was maintained through handwritten lists, notebooks, household books, bells, and personal memory. A housekeeper could have pages of instructions. A cook could maintain recipes and quantities. A butler could track wine and silver. The servant quarters were therefore not simply places of physical work. They were places where information was stored, discussed, and transmitted. A young servant could learn an enormous amount simply by listening. She might hear which local supplier delivered the best vegetables. She might learn how to remove a difficult stain. She might discover which employer paid reliably. She might learn how to fold formal napkins. She might hear about another household that needed staff. Information could change someone's life. A recommendation from one servant to another might lead to a better position. A conversation in the servants' hall could become the beginning of a new career. This network made domestic service less isolated than it might appear. Servants moved between households. They carried information. They maintained friendships. They wrote letters. They attended church. They met on days off. They developed communities. The servant quarters were connected to a much larger social network of domestic workers throughout Victorian society, and because domestic service was so widespread, servants were part of a huge working population. They were not isolated exceptions. They were an important part of the economy of the time. The wealthy household depended on them. Urban employment depended on them. The hospitality of the elite depended on them. The maintenance of large estates depended on them. Their labour was woven into the structure of Victorian life. Yet their work could remain almost completely invisible to visitors. Consider a guest arriving at a mansion for the first time. The front door opens. A servant welcomes them. Their coat is taken. Their luggage disappears. A room is prepared. Tea appears. The guest may assume that the house simply operates this way. But every stage represents labour. Someone opened the door. Someone carried the luggage. Someone prepared the room. Someone arranged the tea. Someone cleaned the cups afterward. Someone returned the coat. The guest sees a sequence of conveniences. The servant sees a sequence of tasks. This difference in perspective is central to understanding domestic service. The household's comfort was the servant's workload, and the larger the household, the more complicated that workload became. A mansion with dozens of rooms required constant movement. There were formal rooms that needed special cleaning, bedrooms that needed daily attention, guest rooms that had to be ready at short notice, bathrooms or washrooms that needed maintenance, kitchens that required constant cleaning, pantries that had to remain organized, storage rooms that had to be inventoried, staircases that had to be swept, windows that needed washing, curtains that needed dusting, furniture that needed polishing. The list seemed endless, and every completed task was temporary. This is what made domestic labor so unusual. There was no final product. A carpenter could finish a table. A builder could finish a wall. A servant could never finish cleaning the house. The house immediately became dirty again. The laundry immediately accumulated again. The dishes immediately returned. The fire immediately needed attention. The servant's work was therefore a continuous cycle. This could create fatigue not only in the body but in the mind. There was always something waiting. Even during moments of rest, a servant might know that another task was approaching. The ringing of a bell could interrupt conversation. A request could interrupt a meal. A family member could change plans and force the schedule to change. The servant had to adapt. Flexibility was essential. This was especially true during large household events. Imagine a mansion preparing for a wedding. For the family, the event represented celebration and social importance. For servants, it could mean days of preparation. Guest rooms had to be cleaned, sheets had to be changed, clothing had to be arranged, food supplies increased, flowers arrived, silver needed polishing. Dining arrangements changed, more people might be employed temporarily. The household could become extremely busy. The servant quarters would also become crowded. Workers might sleep in additional rooms, temporary staff could arrive. Experienced servants had to train them quickly. The hierarchy could become complicated. And after the wedding ended, the work continued. The rooms had to be restored. There was yet another layer to life inside the Victorian servant quarters, and it was the strange relationship servants developed with the house itself. After living inside the same building for months or years, a servant could become intimately familiar with every corner of it. She knew which rooms received morning sunlight and which remained cold throughout the day. She knew which windows rattled when the wind blew, which doors refused to close properly, which floorboards complained beneath a heavy step, and which corridors were safest to cross when the family was entertaining guests. The mansion might have belonged legally to someone else, but the servants knew its physical personality better than almost anyone. A long-serving housemaid could enter a room and immediately recognize that something was wrong. Perhaps a curtain had been moved slightly. Perhaps a chair had been left at an unusual angle. Perhaps an object on a dressing table was missing. These details mattered because servants were expected to maintain the household exactly as the family preferred it. The house had a particular appearance, and anything outside that appearance could be noticed. The longer someone worked there, the more the building became a collection of memories. A particular staircase might remind her of the first week she arrived. A particular bedroom might remind her of a child she had cared for. A particular kitchen corner might remind her of a difficult Christmas. A small attic window might remind her of letters from home. A corridor might remind her of the night. A family member became ill. The house was therefore not simply architecture. It became part of the servant's personal history. This is especially interesting because the servant might eventually leave. When that happened, she did not merely leave a workplace. She left a place whose sounds and routines had become familiar. A new house would have different bells, different stairs, different expectations, and different personalities. Starting again could be exhausting. Yet changing households was common enough that experienced servants became skilled at adaptation. They could walk into a new kitchen and quickly understand its organization. They could observe a new housekeeper and determine what standards were expected. They could learn a new family's routines within days or weeks. This adaptability was itself a professional skill. A servant was not simply hired to perform tasks. She was hired to fit into a household. That meant learning personalities. Some employers wanted absolute quiet. Others expected conversation. Some wanted meals served at exact times. Others were more relaxed. Some insisted on perfect order. Others cared more about speed. A servant had to understand these differences. The same task could be performed differently in different homes. Making a bed was not simply making a bed. One employer might prefer a particular arrangement of blankets. Another might insist on different sheets. One family might expect curtains opened at a certain hour. Another might prefer them closed until breakfast. The servant learned these preferences through experience, and once she knew them, she was expected to remember them without being reminded. This created an extraordinary amount of invisible mental work. The housekeeper might remember dozens of household preferences. The cook might remember dietary restrictions. The butler might remember which guests preferred which wines. The lady's maid might remember clothing sizes and favourite garments. The nursemaid might remember children's routines. The servant's mind became another part of the household's infrastructure. This could also create an unusual intimacy. A servant might know the family better than the family's friends did. She saw people when they were tired. She saw them before they dressed for guests. She saw them when they were sick. She heard them arguing. She saw their children misbehaving. She knew their habits. She knew what they liked for breakfast. She knew what irritated them. She knew which topics they avoided. The family could maintain a polished public image, but the servants often saw the private version. This did not necessarily mean servants were constantly gossiping. Many took discretion seriously. A servant who revealed private information could lose employment and reputation. Instead, the knowledge often remained unspoken. A servant might know something without ever discussing it. That silence could become part of professional pride. A truly trusted servant was someone who could be relied upon to hear everything and repeat almost nothing. This made long-serving servants valuable. Trust accumulated over years. A family might become dependent on a housekeeper who had been there for decades. She knew where everything was. She knew how the household operated. She knew which suppliers to call. She knew how the family liked things done. Replacing her would be difficult. For the servant, however, loyalty could be complicated. Long service might provide stability, but it also meant many years spent inside a social system that was not entirely her own. She could become deeply connected to the family while remaining outside it. This was especially complicated when servants helped raise children. A nursemaid might carry a baby through the early years of life. She might comfort the child during illness. She might teach basic manners. She might supervise play. She might prepare clothes. She might know every childhood fear. The child could become attached to her, but eventually the child would grow. School might begin. A governess might take over. The nursery might no longer need the same level of care. The servant could find herself with a changed role or no role at all. This cycle of attachment and separation was a quiet emotional reality of domestic service. The same thing could happen with elderly family members. A servant might care for an aging relative of the household, becoming responsible for meals, medicines, clothing, and daily comfort. Over time, a close relationship could develop, yet when that person died, the servant could be left grieving while also wondering what would happen to her employment. The house might feel suddenly empty. A room that had been occupied every day could become silent. A servant who had cared for someone for years might have to clean the room after their death. This was one of the cruelest contradictions of domestic service. Personal relationships could develop inside a professional structure that could change without warning. The servants' quarters absorbed these transitions. A room that had once belonged to one worker could be assigned to another. A bed could be occupied by someone new. The household continued. The memories remained with the people who left. This constant movement meant that servant quarters were places of arrival and departure. A new maid arrived with a small suitcase. An older servant left with a trunk. Simone was promoted. Simone was dismissed. Simone married. Simone returned home. Simone moved to another household. The corridors witnessed these changes repeatedly. For a young servant, receiving a new position could be exciting. A better household might mean better wages, more comfortable quarters, and greater opportunities. She might arrive carrying everything she owned in a small trunk, uncertain about what awaited her. Her first impression of the servant quarters could matter enormously. Was the room shared? Was there a window? Was the bed comfortable? Were the other servants friendly? Was the housekeeper strict? How many hours were expected? What did the family eat? When was the day off? These questions could determine whether the position felt promising or frightening. The servants' hall was often the first place where she learnt the answers. Other workers could explain the household. They might warn her about certain habits. They might tell her which doors to knock on. They might explain how the bell system worked. They might tell her what time she needed to wake. This informal orientation could be more useful than any official instruction. The servant community had its own traditions. Certain households were known for generosity. Others were known for demanding work. Some employers were respected, others were avoided. Servants exchanged this information because it affected their livelihoods. A good household could attract experienced workers. A difficult household might struggle to keep staff. This meant reputation existed on both sides. Servants needed good references. Employers also had reputations among servants. The labour market was therefore not entirely one-directional. Experienced servants could sometimes choose between positions. A cook with an excellent reputation might be highly sought after. A housekeeper with decades of experience could command respect. A skilled personal maid could negotiate for better conditions. The more specialized the position, the more valuable experience became. This professional culture makes it inaccurate to imagine every servant as completely powerless. There were constraints, certainly, but there was also agency. Servants made decisions. They changed households. They saved money. They formed relationships. They refused some positions. They sought better employment. They negotiated within the limits available to them, and they developed strategies for surviving difficult circumstances. One strategy was simply becoming indispensable. If an employer trusted a servant completely, replacing her became inconvenient. A servant who knew every detail of the household could have significant practical importance. She might know how to manage the pantry, organize the laundry, oversee junior workers, and communicate with suppliers. But even after the house had become familiar, there were aspects of servant life that could never become completely ordinary. One of them was the strange feeling of living so close to people who possessed enormous wealth while remaining personally separated from that wealth. A servant could spend years inside a mansion and still feel like a visitor in the most beautiful rooms. She could know every drawer in a dressing room, every plate in a cabinet, every garment in a wardrobe, and every preference of the people who lived there. Yet she could never forget that the house belonged to somebody else. The servant quarters provided a physical reminder of that difference. The rooms were usually smaller, simpler, and more functional. There was little space for unnecessary furniture. Every object had a practical purpose. The servant's world was measured in usefulness. A chair was there to sit on, a chest was there to store clothing, a washstand was there for washing, a bed was there for sleeping. Decorative objects were limited because servants had little reason to spend money on decorating a room they might leave at any time. This temporary quality was important. Domestic service could involve frequent movement between households. A servant might remain for several years, but there was always the possibility of another position. The room was therefore not necessarily a permanent home. It was accommodation connected to employment. That fact could make the servant careful about becoming too attached. Yet people become attached anyway. A room becomes familiar. A window becomes familiar. A particular sound in the corridor becomes familiar. The person who works beside you becomes familiar. Even the smell of the kitchen can become comforting. A servant might eventually know the house so well that leaving felt strange. The first morning in a new household could feel almost like starting life again. The bells sounded different. The stairs felt different. The housekeeper had different expectations. The family had different habits. The kitchen had a different rhythm. The servant had to relearn. This constant adaptation could make experienced domestic workers remarkably observant. They learned to study a household before fully committing to it. They watched how senior servants behaved. They noticed whether workers were spoken to respectfully. They paid attention to meal arrangements, schedules, days off, and living conditions. A servant might quickly discover whether a household was considered a good place to work. This information travelled through the servant network. People talked, they remembered. They warned one another. A difficult employer could become known among domestic workers. A generous employer could become equally well known. This created an informal reputation system. The family might interview servants before hiring them. Servants, in their own way, also evaluated families. That does not mean the relationship was equal. It was not. The employer still held far greater economic power, but the servant was not without information or choices. A highly experienced servant could sometimes leave and find another position. A skilled cook might be particularly valuable. A competent housekeeper could find work in another large home. A reliable butler could have a strong professional reputation. This created a career ladder within domestic service. Young workers could enter at the bottom. They could learn. They could improve. They could move upward. The servant quarters were often the starting point for these careers. A young girl might begin with simple tasks: cleaning, carrying, washing, preparing. Over time, she could learn more specialized skills. Perhaps she became a housemaid, then a senior housemaid, then a lady's maid. Eventually, with enough experience, she might become a housekeeper. The journey, but advancement was possible. The same was true in the kitchen. A kitchen maid might begin with washing and cleaning. She could learn food preparation. She might become a cook's assistant. Eventually she could become a cook. A skilled cook could command respect and better wages. This progression gave meaning to learning. Every difficult task could become part of professional training. The servant quarters were therefore also places where skills were transmitted. Older workers taught younger ones because the household needed competent staff. A maid learned how to handle delicate fabrics. A kitchen worker learned how to prepare ingredients. A footman learned formal service. A housekeeper learned household management. The knowledge was practical and often passed verbally. It was not necessarily written in manuals. It was demonstrated. Watch this. Do it this way. Never touch that fabric with too much heat. Always check the room before leaving. Never leave silver unattended. Remember which bell belongs to which room. Make sure the fire is safe before going upstairs. These instructions could become deeply ingrained. After years, the servant could perform them without conscious thought. Muscle memory became part of professionalism. A maid could fold a sheet almost automatically. A butler could arrange a table without hesitation. A cook could prepare ingredients while simultaneously supervising other workers. Efficiency became a form of expertise, and expertise could create pride. This pride is important because it reveals another side of servant life that can easily be overlooked. Not every servant saw herself only as exploited labour. Many saw themselves as skilled professionals. They took pride in doing things correctly. They could judge the quality of another servant's work. They knew when a room had been properly cleaned. They knew when silver had been polished correctly. They knew when a meal had been prepared well. They had standards. They had professional identities. A housekeeper might take enormous pride in the condition of her household. A cook might be proud of a particular recipe. A gardener might care deeply about the appearance of a garden. A lady's maid might be proud of her employer's appearance. because she had helped create it. The household's public image could therefore become a reflection of servant skill. This made praise meaningful. A simple compliment from an employer could brighten an entire day, but criticism could have the opposite effect. Because servants were often judged constantly, a harsh word could remain in their minds. A servant might replay the mistake later. She might worry about whether her employer was dissatisfied. She might become more careful the next day. The servant quarters could therefore become places where workers discussed criticism. Did I do something wrong? Why was she angry? Was the room not clean enough? What should I do differently tomorrow? Other servants could offer advice. This support could help workers cope with pressure. The servants' hall was not merely a dining area. It was a place of emotional processing. People brought the day's experiences into the room. They talked about what happened. They interpreted events. They laughed at absurd situations. They worried about serious ones. They shared information. And sometimes they simply sat quietly together. This companionship could be one of the most valuable aspects of domestic service. A person might be far from home, but she was not completely alone. She had co-workers. She had people who understood the strange rules of the household. She had people who knew what it meant to be summoned by a bell. She had people who knew how exhausting a formal dinner could be. She had people who understood the frustration of cleaning the same room twice in one day. That shared experience created solidarity. It could also create humor. Humor was a way of surviving difficult work. A servant might imitate a demanding employer after leaving the room. Someone might tell a ridiculous story about a guest. Someone might joke about how many cups of tea a particular person drank. Someone might laugh about a kitchen mistake that had become funny only after the danger had passed. These moments gave the servants a world of their own. The family might have formal conversations upstairs. The servants had informal conversations downstairs. The contrast could be dramatic. The formal rooms demanded restraint. The servants' quarters allowed personality. This did not mean servants could always relax completely. Rules still existed, but the atmosphere could be much more human. The servants' room also offered a different kind of freedom. A servant could decide how to arrange her belongings. She could decide which letter to keep visible. She could decide where to place her shoes. She could choose whether to read before sleeping. These tiny decisions were important because so many other decisions were outside her control. In a life structured by commands, small choices mattered. Perhaps this is why personal objects become so significant when imagining servant bedrooms. A photograph was not simply decoration. It was identity. A letter was not simply paper. It was connection. A small piece of jewelry was not simply an accessory. It could be a reminder of someone who loved her. A book was not simply, it could be an escape. A pressed flower could carry a memory. The servant's room could therefore contain an emotional landscape that the bare architecture does not reveal. The walls were plain, the life was not. There were also moments of celebration. A servant might receive news of a sibling's marriage. She might hear that a family member had found work. She might receive a gift. She might be promoted. She might earn a better position. She might become engaged. These events could bring excitement to the quarters. Other servants might congratulate her. There was a final, deeper layer to the hidden world of Victorian servants that is easy to miss when we focus only on their exhausting schedules. They were constantly negotiating the boundary between being seen and being invisible. The household needed them to be visible at exactly the right moment and invisible at almost every other moment. A servant who was too slow could be criticized, but a servant who appeared unnecessarily could also be considered intrusive. The perfect servant was present when needed, silent when not needed, and capable of anticipating a request before it was spoken. They learned to stand in particular places, wait in particular corridors, and use particular doors. They could spend hours in rooms without becoming part of the conversation. During dinner, a servant might stand beside a table surrounded by wealthy guests, while hearing every word, yet remain almost completely outside the social interaction. The guests might discuss politics, travel, marriages, money, fashion, or scandals, and the servant would hear it all while continuing to serve wine or remove plates. That required an extraordinary level of self-control. The servant could not simply react naturally to what was being said. She could not laugh at a joke unless the situation allowed it. She could not interrupt a conversation. She could not show surprise at private information. She had to maintain professional distance. Then, when the dinner was over, she might return to the servants' hall and finally discuss what had happened. The transformation could be almost immediate. In the servants' hall, relaxed, in front of guests, silent among colleagues, expressive in uniform, professional. In the bedroom, private. This division of personality was part of the job. It also meant that servants developed a remarkable ability to read people. They had to know when someone wanted assistance and when they wanted to be left alone. They learnt to recognize moods from facial expressions, voices, footsteps, and even the way a door was closed. A servant might know that a particular employer was angry simply by the way they placed a cup on the table. Another might recognize that a child was frightened by the sound of their voice. A lady's maid might know that her employer was nervous before an important social event because she became unusually quiet. The servant's work therefore required emotional intelligence long before that phrase became common. Understanding people was part of serving them, and because servants lived inside the household, they experienced those moods repeatedly. A difficult morning could affect the entire staff. If the mistress of the house was upset, everyone might become more cautious. If the master was entertaining important guests, expectations could become stricter. If a child was ill, the normal routine could disappear entirely. If the family was preparing to travel, everyone could become extremely busy. The servant quarters absorbed these changes. They were where workers compared information and tried to understand what was happening. Why is everyone rushing today? Who is arriving? How long will the guests stay? Why was the dining room changed? Who is ill? Why has the housekeeper called everyone together? These questions help servants make sense of the household. Information was power because knowing what was coming allowed them to prepare. A servant who knew a large party was arriving could organize clothing, linen, and supplies in advance. A cook who knew how many guests were expected could prepare quantities. A housekeeper who knew the family was traveling could plan the staff's schedule. Preparation reduced chaos, and preparation was one of the hidden skills that made wealthy domestic life appear effortless. The family might wake up and find everything ready. They did not see the planning that had happened hours earlier. This was especially true of mornings after late social events. A family could return from a party at midnight and expect the house to be ready the next morning. Servants had to clean. They had to prepare breakfast. They had to restore order. They had to make it appear that the previous evening had never happened. This ability to reset the household was one of the most exhausting parts of service. Every event had to disappear. The evidence of guests had to be removed. Glasses washed. Dishes cleaned, furniture restored, ashes cleared, rooms aired, waste removed, clothing collected. The mansion returned to normal. The family could begin another day without thinking about the previous night's labor. The servants remembered it. They carried the memory into their rooms. This cycle of preparation and restoration meant that servants became experts in resetting time. After a celebration, they restored an ordinary day. After an illness, they restored order. After a journey, they unpacked. After a guest departed, they cleaned the room. After a meal, they cleared the evidence. The household was constantly being returned to its ideal appearance. That ideal appearance was one of the main products of domestic service. Not food, not cleaning, not clothing. The final product was an atmosphere of comfort, an atmosphere of order, an atmosphere in which everything appeared to happen naturally. The servants created that atmosphere through countless small actions. This is why the servant quarters are so important to understanding Victorian life. They reveal that comfort was labour, intensive. The more luxurious the lifestyle, the more labour was hidden behind it. A mansion could contain dozens of rooms, because dozens of people might be needed to maintain them. A formal wardrobe could contain hundreds of garments, because someone had to clean and organise them. Large dinner parties could occur because kitchen and service staff were available. Children could have elaborate nurseries because nurses and maids worked there. The garden could look perfect because gardeners worked constantly. The family could travel comfortably because servants prepared everything. The servants were the infrastructure, and the infrastructure lived in hidden rooms. Another fascinating part of these quarters was the way workers marked time through sounds rather than clocks alone. A servant might know that dawn was approaching because birds became louder outside. She might recognize the beginning of breakfast preparation from the sounds of the kitchen. She might know that the family had gone to bed when the last footsteps disappeared from the main staircase. The house had a daily soundtrack. Servants knew every part of it. The kitchen had its own sounds: knives, pots, water, fire, doors, voices. The laundry had its own sounds: water, fabric, iron, movement. The service corridors had footsteps. The dining room had quieter movements. The nursery had children's voices. The formal rooms had conversations. The servants' hall had laughter and discussion. The bedroom corridors became quiet at night. Together, these sounds formed the life of the house. A servant who had worked there for years could probably tell where she was without seeing the room, simply by listening. This level of familiarity could be comforting, but it could also make the house difficult to leave behind. When a servant moved to another household, she had to learn a completely new soundtrack. A different bell, a different staircase, a different kitchen, a different rhythm, a different set of expectations. The first weeks in a new house could be mentally exhausting because nothing was automatic. Everything had to be learned again. This is one reason experienced servants valued stable households. Familiarity reduced mental effort. You knew what was expected. You knew where everything was. You knew who to ask. You knew how the day unfolded. Stability could be valuable even when the work itself was hard. And sometimes the servant's room itself became part of that stability. The bed was familiar. The window was familiar. The view was familiar. The sounds were familiar. The same small objects remained in the same places. In a life dominated by constant demands, familiarity provided comfort. This may explain why servants sometimes stayed with households for many years despite the obvious disadvantages of the job. They had created a life inside the structure. They knew everyone. They had earned trust. They had a reliable income. Leaving could mean losing all of that. The choice was not always simple. For an outside observer, quitting a difficult job might seem obvious. For a servant, leaving could mean finding another place to live, another employer, another reference, another network of co-workers, and perhaps another city. The servant quarters therefore offered a form of security even while limiting freedom. This contradiction existed throughout domestic service. The room was small, but it was provided. The meals were modest, but they were available. The wages might be limited, but they were regular. The schedule was demanding, but it was predictable. The household could be strict, but it was also familiar. For some workers, these advantages mattered. For others, the limitations became unbearable. The experience depended on the person and the household. This is why a single description cannot capture servant life. The world contained enormous variation. A large aristocratic estate was not the same as a middle-class urban home. A cook's experience was not the same as a footman's. A housekeeper's experience was not the same as a kitchen maid's. A young, unmarried servant's life was not the same as an older married worker. The longer you imagine life inside a Victorian servant's quarters, the more obvious it becomes that the hidden side of the house had its own daily geography, its own unwritten rules, and its own sense of time. The grand rooms were arranged around comfort, appearance, and social life, while the servant areas were arranged around movement and efficiency. Every cupboard, passage, staircase, and doorway had a purpose. The servants learned this hidden geography so completely that they could navigate it almost without thinking. A new servant might become lost during the first few days, but an experienced worker could carry a tray, a bucket, a stack of linen, or a basket of clothing through the house, while barely glancing at the walls. The servant knew which doors opened toward the kitchen and which led into formal rooms. She knew where the family was most likely to appear. She knew which stairs were safest when carrying something heavy. She knew where to wait when a guest was approaching. She knew where the housekeeper kept spare supplies. She knew which cupboards were locked and which were always available. She knew which corridors became busy during dinner and which were quiet after dark. The mansion's official architecture might have been designed for beauty, but its hidden architecture was designed for work. That distinction could be seen everywhere. The grand staircase might be wide, polished, and beautifully decorated. The service stairs might be narrow, plain, and steep. The formal entrance might be impressive, while the servants entered through a much less noticeable door. The dining room might be spacious and elegant, while the pantry behind it was crowded with shelves, dishes, and equipment. One world was designed to be seen, the other was designed to function. Servants lived inside the functioning world. They moved through spaces that visitors rarely noticed, and they developed an intimate knowledge of how those spaces connected. A housemaid might know that the fastest route from the laundry to the bedrooms involved a particular staircase. A footman might know exactly where to stand when waiting for a carriage. A cook might know which pantry shelf held a particular ingredient without looking. Efficiency was not simply desirable. It was survival. The household had too many tasks to allow servants to waste time. A servant who took the long route repeatedly would lose valuable minutes. A servant who forgot where things belonged would create additional work. A servant who failed to prepare early could cause problems later. The entire system depended on timing. The first hours of the day were especially important because several tasks overlapped. Breakfast preparations might begin while bedrooms were still being cleaned. Fires needed attention while clothing was being prepared. Children might need supervision while adults were getting dressed. Servants therefore worked in layers. Zone task began. The kitchen might already be preparing breakfast while the housemaids were still upstairs. The housekeeper might be checking supplies while the butler prepared the dining room. The nursery staff might be waking children while other servants carried hot water. The household became active gradually, but the servant workforce was already operating at full speed. This explains why sleep was so valuable. A servant who had only a few hours between the end of one day and the beginning of another had little time for anything else. The bedroom therefore became a sanctuary, even if it was tiny. A bed did not need to be beautiful to feel precious. After a long day of climbing stairs, standing, lifting, scrubbing, and carrying, lying down could be the best part of the entire day. The room might be cold, the mattress might be simple, the blanket might be thin, but exhaustion could make almost any bed feel welcoming. A servant might remove her shoes, sit for a moment, and realize that her entire body was aching. The feet had carried her across the house. The hands had cleaned, the shoulders had lifted, the back had bent, the body had worked, and now finally it could stop. For a few hours, this physical exhaustion was part of domestic service that modern observers can easily underestimate. Many household tasks that are now performed by machines once required direct physical effort. Cleaning a large home was not simply wiping a few surfaces. It involved moving furniture, carrying supplies, sweeping, washing, polishing, and climbing. The servant's body became a tool, and like any tool, it could become worn. Hands could become rough, shoes could wear out, clothing could become damaged, muscles could ache. The worker might continue anyway. This is why a servant's room could contain small forms of self-care. Perhaps she repaired her shoes. Perhaps she rubbed tired feet. Perhaps she washed her hands carefully. Perhaps she stitched a damaged garment. Perhaps she rested longer than usual on a rare day off. These activities were not luxuries. They were ways of maintaining the body needed for work. The servant's physical condition directly affected the household. If she could not work, someone else had to take over her duties. This meant servants had to be careful about injuries and illness. A small problem could become serious if ignored, but admitting weakness could also feel risky. A servant might worry that illness would make her seem unreliable. The pressure to remain useful could therefore encourage people to work even when exhausted. This was particularly difficult for older servants. Years of physical labor could accumulate. A woman who had spent decades carrying, cleaning, lifting, and standing might eventually find the work harder. Yet experience could move her into a less physically demanding position. A senior housekeeper, for example, might supervise more than she cleaned. An experienced cook might direct kitchen workers rather than performing every task herself. Advancement could therefore become a way of preserving. The servant quarters could contain workers at every stage of life. Young beginners, experienced adults, older supervisors, each had different relationships with the work. A young servant might be excited by the possibility of advancement. An older servant might value stability. A senior worker might be thinking about retirement. The household was therefore also a place where age shaped experience. The youngest workers were often closest to the most physically demanding tasks. They had the least authority. They were still learning. They could be corrected frequently, but they also had time to develop skills and move upward. The older workers had greater knowledge. They might command respect, but they also knew how difficult it was to start. This created a natural mentorship system. A young maid might quietly watch an older housemaid. She learned how to arrange a room, how to handle difficult stains, how to fold linen, how to speak to the housekeeper, how to avoid unnecessary attention. The older worker might not even realize how much she was teaching simply through demonstration. This is how practical knowledge survives. One person watches another, then eventually teaches someone else. The servant quarters were full of these invisible lessons. The same applied in kitchens. A young worker might watch a cook prepare a dish. She learned how much heat to use, how to judge when something was finished, how to organize ingredients, how to manage several tasks at once. Cooking was not simply following a recipe. It required judgment. Experienced cooks could prepare large meals under pressure because they had developed instinct. The same was true of household management. A housekeeper could walk into a room and immediately notice what needed attention. She knew how long a task would take. She knew which workers were capable of handling it. She knew how to organize the day. This expertise was often invisible because the result was simply that everything worked. A well-run household did not appear organized. It appeared natural. The family woke. Breakfast arrived, rooms were clean, clothing was ready, the house was warm. Guests were welcomed, meals appeared. Nothing seemed difficult. But the servant quarters contained the people who made it look easy. This invisible efficiency was one of the most remarkable achievements of the domestic service system. It required coordination between people who might rarely speak directly. The cook did not need to know everything the housekeeper knew. The maid did not need to know everything the butler knew. But each person needed enough information to perform their role. Senior servants became communication links. The housekeeper might pass instructions to female staff. The butler might coordinate male servants. The cook might communicate with the household manager. Messages moved through the system. In large houses, bells made communication even more immediate. A bell could signal that someone was needed. Servants learned the signals. A particular bell might correspond to a particular room. A particular time of day could suggest a particular request. The ringing of bells became part of the household soundtrack. For the family, the bell was a convenience. For servants, it was a command. The difference is important. The person ringing the bell did not have to think about who would answer. The servant did. A bell meant movement. It meant interruption. It meant another task. Sometimes it meant something urgent. Sometimes it was something trivial. The servant did not know until she responded. This uncertainty could make bells stressful. A servant could be sitting down for a meal and suddenly hear one. She had to stand. She had to go. She might return minutes later.